Well, I'm glad to have everybody in this eSeminar, and it looks like we've got a really nice range of experience, and we have a nice range of people from throughout the state of New York, which is one of our main goals for using the eSeminar format. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm hoping this will all work as I get to my screen. Let me go to this and see if this will do it. So I'm assuming everybody can see my screen. And we want to spend some time talking today about how to become a successful trustee. And the good news in all of this is that we really do know the practices that make a good trustee. I like to start off with this quote from Peter Drucker, and Peter Drucker is a management person. And a lot of people know Peter's work from the for-profit sector, but he did quite a bit of work in the not-for-profit sector. And so what he says about not-for-profits is that we should have an inscription over every board room for not-for-profits. It basically says that this board, being on a NYSAIS board or on any nonprofit board, is not really about power, which I know none of us really get into being on boards for power. But it's really about responsibility, and it's responsibility for the organization, responsibility to the board itself, responsibility to the staff, and responsibility to the institution's mission, in our case, the school's mission. So this is, I think, a way to help us frame our thoughts as we're thinking about the work we do as trustees, as board chairs, on the audit committee, as new trustees, as experienced trustees. I have basically, I think, 5 goals for us in this eSeminar today. One is, I'd be remiss if I didn't just really give you a quick thumbnail about NYSAIS and the things that NYSAIS provides to all of our member schools. I'm going to then spend some time talking about the role and responsibilities of trustees in an independent school. I really want us to spend time thinking about how do we go about taking what I would call the strategic view, because the trustees are the group that are responsible for taking this strategic view as you think about your school now and you think about your school in the future. I want to think about dashboards and look at some dashboards and how do you measure the health of the school? And often trustees will ask themselves, how do I know if the school is doing what it's supposed to do? What am I supposed to do as a trustee? What are my responsibilities? What are the things I should be paying attention to? And that's where dashboards will come in. And then finally, I'll conclude with resources that do exist for trustees. So NYSAIS was founded in 1948. We have now 196 member schools and organizations. Within NYSAIS, there's about 79,000 students and their families in NYSAIS schools. To put that into some type of perspective, if you were to combine the Buffalo, Rochester, and Capital Region school districts, I think that they have a little less than 79,000 students total. So in NYSAIS schools throughout the state, we really do represent a really substantial number of independent school students. That being said, within the state of New York, there's almost 500,000 students who are in non-public schools, and that would include the Catholic schools and the Jewish schools and the various non-public schools throughout the state. We basically provide our members with 3 major areas of support. One is an accreditation, and I think a couple of you mentioned accreditation. I think, Michael, you mentioned that. And that is something that NYSAIS spends quite a bit of time on. George is responsible for that. Judy's responsible for that. And we have a commission on accreditation that oversees the accreditation process. The next area that NYSAIS provides is guidance and professional development. So eSeminar, NYSAIS-Now, we have live stream, we have professional development conferences, professional development workshops. We really reach a vast majority of people throughout the independent school world and the NYSAIS world through our professional development. And I like to say that the professional development is really what helps us create the fabric of the NYSAIS schools, that really sense of community that you really see within NYSAIS. You may or may not know this, but we do quite a bit of legislative work and advocacy on behalf of our schools. NYSAIS does have a lobbyist. The lobbyist works for us up in Albany. I spent quite a bit of time speaking with them about legislation. We're at the beginning of a legislative cycle right now, and there's several pieces of legislation that NYSAIS is spending its time looking at and paying attention to on behalf of all the member schools. The one that's getting the most press right now is the tuition tax credit, scholarship tax credit that's Governor Cuomo has linked with the DREAM Act, and so we'll see how that plays out in Albany. But that is something that we follow, and we do develop positions on each of these pieces of legislation. So that's a very quick thumbnail about NYSAIS. Let me switch over now talking about how trustees really take the strategic view, and it really does start with you as trustees. The good news about all this is that we know that good governance does not happen by accident. It happens on purpose. And when we see a school that's going really well and everything is running well, it's because governance is running very well. Governance and administration are in line with each other. They're thinking, they're supporting each other. Governance doing its piece, administration doing their piece. So we know that it really does happen on purpose, not by accident. Up on the screen, you see two reference books, and these will be in my resources that I'll give to you at the end of this. One in the upper right is the Trustee Handbook by Mary DeKuyper, put out by NAIS. If you don't have a copy of that, you should have a copy of that. That really is a terrific handbook for trustees and gives you a good understanding of the way trustees should organize themselves and the way they should behave on an individual basis as well as a group basis. The lower left one is the Nonprofit Answer Book by Board Source, and that is an excellent book. It's organized around questions and answers for dozens and dozens and dozens of topics. What should I do if? And I really would recommend this book. Because we know these practices and these are all readily available, I encourage new trustees and experienced trustees to get your hands on these books. If you want these last two I'm showing, one is Governance as Leadership, that's put out by Dick Chait. Excellent book, reframing the work of nonprofit boards. I'd highly recommend that book again. And that's getting a little more detail into what makes a good trustee. And then the one in the lower right, 5 Life Stages, I really like that book a lot. Because it really helps you frame the idea of the life stage that organizations go through, nonprofits go through, from that startup phase with that charismatic leader, whether it's on the board or in the leadership of the head, all the way through the various phases of a nonprofit organization. I'd recommend the book. I'm not going to go into that book at all this evening, but I would highly recommend it. So let me start with the definition of trustees, and I will try to make this interactive a little bit. So I'm going to put up what NYSAIS is the way we describe a board of trustees. And I'd like you just to read this. I'm hoping all of you are able to see my screen. And then I think I'd like you to unmute your microphones and just tell me a little bit about what you think this is saying as far as your responsibility as a board of trustees. So you can just unmute your mic and just hop in.
This is Charles Cusano of Maplebrook. It looks to me like we're clearly defining that the board takes care of overseeing the business side without interfering with the educational side of the school.
Okay, that's one. Great, excellent. What else?
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, we got you, Michael.
Okay. That the board doesn't deal with day-to-day issues, but rather sort of looks towards the long-term sustainability of things.
Right, excellent. Yeah, and if you notice also the things I've highlighted in green, it's a deliberative group. So the good board tries to put together it's a complex organization in and of itself, and the idea of deliberating and discussing is really the key of good boards, being a really good functioning board. The other issue is the clearly defined roles, that everybody knows what's going on, and that the board does attend to policy. We often will miss this topic of mission. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, but it really always comes back to the mission. So this is the way NYSAIS defines the Board of Trustees. And I'll give you some examples of the ways that NYSAIS provides guidance to trustees. One is through our accreditation. I think, Michael, you mentioned that you're going through an accreditation process pretty soon over at Rudolph Shalom. And ultimately, all of you go through a NYSAIS accreditation process. Our manual for evaluation is an important document for schools as they begin to understand themselves better all the way through. whether it's governance, whether it's mission, whether it's their curriculum, whether it's a relationship with the faculty or the relationship with their neighbors. Governance in the NYSAIS manual is a key section. It is the second section of the manual. And in the NYSAIS manual, there are actually 19 criteria in the governance section. I think that may be the one that has the most criteria of all the sections. And that's mainly because it reflects our belief that when trust governance runs well, the school will run well. And when everybody does the pieces that they should do in their various responsibilities, that's what makes a school unique and work well. We also have what we would call our principles of best practice for trustees, which is available to trustees that we send out to the heads and to the board chairs. So I'm going to give you an example here of the section. This is section 2, governance and criteria. And I'm just going to show you a few because this will tie in later on at the end of this to the self-evaluation that boards do. So we have 19 criteria. This is the first one. The governance of the school is clearly defined, it's transparent, and it's understood by all constituencies. That's a complicated compound sentence because you could be good in one and not good in the other parts. And we ask boards to rate themselves on a 1 to 6. Are you full? 6 being it's fully and completely met, to 1, you have no idea that you're doing this or not. It's not met in any respect. But this is we put this as the first one because this is a very clear part of being a successful board, that it's clearly defined and transparent. The group that is responsible for providing the continuity of the school is the trustees. It is not the administration necessarily. It is not the staff. It is not the parents. If you think about NYSAIS schools, we have schools within NYSAIS that are 300 years old. We have Emma Willard up in the Capital Region that just celebrated its 200th anniversary. And the group that is continuous through time are the trustees. And your responsibility is to not only check on the continuity of the mission, but also the validity of the mission, the importance of the mission. Number 2.3 is that you provide stability both in transitions for the leadership of the board as well as the head of school. That's a really critical time for schools, is the transition of board chairs as well as a transition of head of school. So that is an important characteristic for a board. It is, again, one of our criteria. And I'm not going to go through all 19, but I'm just showing you that what I'm going to suggest to you is that you yourself look at our second chapter of our manual, and you look at these 19 areas and you assess yourselves, and we'll talk about that at the end. The group that's responsible for generating the idea of the strategic planning and making sure that it happens, that it's not only done, but then it happens, the follow-up takes place, is the governing body. That is your responsibility as trustees, that there is strategic planning. And sometimes schools are talking about, and we're seeing more of this, should we have a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan? And I'm really been encouraging schools to think more along the lines of strategic thinking. So we say strategic planning, but sometimes strategic planning says point A to point B to point C. And in fact, sometimes we know that it goes point A off to the side, then point C, and then point D or B backwards. So the idea is looking for strategic opportunities. And number 2.5 is that your governing body ensures that the school has adequate financial resources, and that when you launch initiatives that they're funded properly, that they've been fully vetted financially. So this is an example of the way we want trustees to think about their responsibility as governance. There are 19 of these. We can send you, if you want, a copy of this section of the manual, just a section, and you can then look at the criteria and think through how you're doing and how your board is doing. So I'm going to talk basically about 3 duties of trustees, and this really does come from the work of Dick Chait in that one of those books I mentioned. And so we're going to talk about the duty of care as a trustee, the duty of loyalty as a trustee, and the duty of obedience as a trustee. And I'm seeing that a lot of you are taking notes. And George, we can send them a copy of this presentation. So I'll be happy to send you a copy of this presentation, so you can have this, so you don't have to take quite as many notes. So let's put some meat on the bones and talk a little bit about what does the duty of care mean. The duty of care really is about you as a trustee actively participating and making decisions on behalf of the school using your best judgment in doing so. What that basically means is you check your other hats at the door. So when you come into the board meeting and the meeting gets started, you are a trustee. Your responsibility is to do what is on the best interest of the school. And I have to tell you, having been on a number of boards and chaired a number of boards, sometimes it's not in your own personal best interest, but you still have to make the decision that is on the best decision for that school. Trustees need to set aside your own professional and personal interests. The organizational needs come first. And then the duty of obedience is really knowing that you have the legal responsibility to make sure that the organization is not only true to its mission, but it's complying with all laws, so which they're local laws here in New York City, there are state laws, or there are federal laws. So those three areas, duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, are the three key duties of responsibility of trustees in the broad sense. Any comments or questions so far? Okay, we'll move on. So often trustees will ask, well, what should I know about the school? What's important to know about the school? Well, first of all, you as a trustee should know the history of the school. You should be able to give that 2-minute elevator speech about how the school was founded, what the school's philosophy is, and something of the history of the school. Because again, as a trustee, you are not only the keeper of the flame, you are also the group that has to be thinking about where the school is now and where it's going in the future. You should know the recent history of the board, what's gone on on the board level, not just who has participated, but what's been going on. What are the conversations that the board has been having over the last couple of years? A key piece is knowing the governance structure and the relationship of management and staff. How does the board communicate to management? How does the board communicate to staff? Is it through the board chair? Is it through the executive committee? Keeping in mind that as a trustee, you have absolutely zero power on your own when you're outside of the board, meaning you're just whoever your day job is. So that's for good reason. You know, it's really hard for a head of school to have 20 bosses and have 20 people come in giving 20 different points of view. So what is the governance structure? How does the management work? How does the board work? What's the committee structure? Most boards that really work well use a committee structure to full advantage. And so what are the committees? We always recommend a couple of standing committees, but the idea of creating ad hoc committees that have a specific purpose, a specific timeline, and then do their job and then disband is really a good practice for boards to think about, particularly as you're doing some of that strategic work.
Hey, Mark, if I can interrupt. Sure. We have a question in the chat.
Sure.
Whose responsibility is it to give new trustees a history of the board? And that was from Valerie.
Valerie, that would be the responsibility of that should actually be a joint responsibility with the board chair, perhaps the board chair and the executive committee, as well as the head of school. So that would be done during the trustee orientation. And sometimes there's something written out about that. We have samples of agendas that boards can use with their orientations of new trustees.
Michael commented that they do it in the orientation as well.
Great place to do it, Michael. Yeah. So what are the documents that you should be seeing as either a new trustee or an experienced trustee? So one, the bylaws are always the source documents. You need to know your bylaws. You need to know what they say. Even if you are a brand new trustee, you should have become familiar with the bylaws and know them over a period of time, because those are your guiding corporate documents for the organization. What is the mission statement of the school? And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes, and the responsibility that we need to have to the mission. Budgets, current and past. Budgets are documents that really show priorities. Schools may say their highest priority is professional development, but maybe they're spending very little on professional development. So budgets are a good way to really manage the school, and that is your fiduciary responsibility as trustees. Board and committee minutes, we suggest that you know them, have them for the past 2 years if that's possible. At NYSAIS, we put all of our minutes, we use the cloud for everything, and our trustees have access to a section in the cloud that has all the past minutes, all the past documents for the boards. That's a really good way to make things accessible for board members. The audit, somebody was on the audit committee, I believe, and what does the audit say? Beyond just the audit, though, NYSAIS requires the management letter. And so that's really where the school is looking at the internal controls of the school. So it's not just an audit, and it's not just something that's the responsibility of the finance committee. It's also something that's responsibility of all trustees. Often there's times where new trustees will say, well, there's a finance committee, they take care of that. That is true. They're the ones that should drill down deeper, but the responsibility for understanding the finances of the school rests with all trustees. Conflict of interest form, that should be done on an annual basis, and you should disclose your conflict of interest with the rest of the board, and then the board needs to make a decision whether that conflict is serious enough that it disqualifies you from being a trustee, or more likely, whether it just means that there's certain things that you have to step out of the conversation on. Even though it's not really a conflict of interest, one of the conflicts of interest that does happen to all of us is time. We all have other things, and we have busy lives. So we have to think about when we're saying, oh boy, I wish this meeting would get over right now because I've got to go do X, Y, Z. When you're a trustee, sometimes you have to say, I got to set that aside. I really have to take care of my responsibilities as a trustee. And then what is a short range and long range plan for the school? So NYSAIS identifies some what we would call principles of best practice for the school. And they're partially, we've talked about some of these. One is that you separate the interests of the school from a particular child or a constituency. You don't represent a constituency as a trustee. You represent the school. And so there are times, so even though you may have a child in the 3rd grade, you're not the 3rd grade representative. You represent the school, you oversee the entire school and the policies of the entire school. Same thing is true with maybe perhaps your own child. And I have to say, as a trustee, as a father of 2 sons who went through independent schools, and I was a trustee at their school, I think it's important for trustees to help staff know when you go in to meet them that they're going to look at you differently, and you have to set them at ease and let them know you're not, when you're meeting as a parent or with the other parents in the class, you're not working as a trustee at that point in time. This is really a critical one, which is you accept and support board decisions. And this doesn't mean that the trustees are a rubber stamp group. What this really means is that there should be a lively conversation that goes on in the board meeting when the board is talking about whatever topic it happens to be. All points of view should be fully vetted. There should be disagreement within the board. That is healthy. That is a very healthy practice. Once the board makes a decision as a collective and they decide to chart a course, everyone needs to accept that. Even though that may not have been exactly the decision that you wanted, you have to learn to accept the board decisions and really advocate for those decisions. You should never become involved in specific management, personnel, or curricular issues. That is not your responsibility as a board. Those go to the head of school. A trustee should keep all board deliberations confidential. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this one. There's a story I tell about this one often, which is of one board that I know of that actually disintegrated as a board because one of the board members was telling a spouse what was going on in the board meeting, to the point that they were telling exactly what each person in the board meeting said in the positions. And you can imagine what happened in the parking lot the next day when that word got out. Eventually, the board stopped talking to each other. When they became the most dysfunctional is when they separated into 2 camps within the board and they held parallel board meetings. You can imagine the dysfunction for that school and the way that set that school back for actually a number of years. And it took the board quite a while to resurrect that. And it all became out as a result of this one because the board members did not keep their deliberations confidential. If you leave from nothing else this afternoon from this eSeminar, this is an important piece of being a good board person, is knowing that what you talk about really has to stay in that board meeting. You should regularly assess your effectiveness as a governing body. And if I had to say one area that we see boards tend to not do as well and not as often as they should, this is the area. You should be talking about yourselves as a board. How well are you doing as a board? And I'm going to show you a form that you can use for that and a process you can go through with You should support the school and the head of school, and you should always demonstrate that support within the community. The authority rests with the entire board. Again, when you are by yourself, you're just an individual. It's when the board is in a meeting that the board has collective power. And you should actively participate in the development efforts of the school, the fundraising efforts of the school as a trustee, either of your own financial resources or of your time, or it's the idea of you give or you get. So either you give or you get resources for the school. That's part of being a trustee in any nonprofit. So when we're looking at a healthy board, the board where the governance is running really well, we look at several things. One, this is so easy. You only have one employee to worry about. You don't have a whole host of, many of you run businesses, you work in other organizations, and there's a lot of people you have to pay attention to. In this case, you really pay attention to the one employee, and that's your head of school. That person implements the board policies. That person has the complete authority over the faculty and staff, the selection, the evaluation, the dismissal of staff. That's what that person has to do. Now, that doesn't mean that they work in a vacuum, because they don't. They work in conjunction, and it's a partnership between the head of school and the board, either through the board chair or the executive committee. I always tell boards and heads, no one should ever be surprised. So heads should make a promise they'll do their best not to surprise boards. Boards should make a promise that they'll do their best not to surprise heads. So everybody should be informed about action that's being taken by the boards. And all of you, head, administration, board, you're responsible for developing and monitoring the board's resources. Are you leaving the school in better condition than the condition you found it in when you started as a board member? And as a head, are you leaving it as a better condition as a head of school?
Hey, Mark, we have another question, sorry.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
What's your feeling on having an executive committee?
Yeah, a lot of boards, it's a very common practice to have an executive committee. That's a nice group for the head to work with. Often executive committees, the board head of school works with the executive committee, so I think that's a very good practice, and it's quite common. When you're making decisions as a board, everything starts with your mission. So some things I want you to just think about is, why is that the case? Why should it start with your mission? What do you as a trustee know about your school's mission? And then the last piece I'd like you to think about is your school's mission still relevant? And that's where we suggest at NYSAIS that schools review the mission. We require it as part of the accreditation process, but really that should be tested every few years. Is what you're doing now still serving the population that you think you're serving? And is the mission still a relevant mission? So those are three questions that you might want to ask about your mission at your school. Why should everything start with a mission? What do you know about your mission? And is the mission at your school still relevant? So what should you focus on as a trustee? Again, I'm going to give you three areas that you should focus on. One is what we would call the fiduciary mode. The next one is what we would call the generative mode. And the last one is what we would call the strategic mode. So if you do nothing else, this first one is the one that you have to pay attention to. This is the bedrock. This is the foundation of good governance. This makes sure that you are faithful to the mission. You're accountable for performance. You comply with laws and regulations. If you do nothing other than this one, you've satisfied the foundations of being a good board, the fiduciary responsibility, because that is your legal fiduciary responsibility as a board. Now, we often look at who do we bring onto boards, and we try to bring on a variety of people onto boards who have a variety of strengths. So this next area is really important, and this is what we would call the generative mode. And that is where it's really a partnership between the board and the administration in making sense of ambiguous situations. We never get perfect information. I mean, sometimes we do, but rarely do we get perfect information. And so as the head's trying to sort through things and the administration's trying to sort through information, trends, and I'll show you something in just a minute, so we'll think about this in relationship to this. That's where the thinking of the board really comes in, and the expertise, and everybody's seeing it from a different perspective. So you're all as a group trying to make sense of ambiguous situations that are not clear as you begin to think about strategies, plans, and decisions. And from that then flows the strategic mode. So basically, strategic mode is really charting your course. You've made sense of all this. You think you've got it figured out, this ambiguous situation. And now strategic is how do we get to where we want to go? And that is I think as a board, that's the really challenging and interesting part of being on the board. The fiduciary is the reports, the business, but the generative and the mode and the strategic mode are the ones I think that engages trustees and really uses their talents to the best advantage for the school. So I'm going to show you a quick video, and I want you just to think about the strategic implications for independent schools based on this. And this is showing the world in 2015 and what's going on right now. And what does this mean for your school? Let's see if I can get this going, and we'll see how this works. So you can see that this is just one idea, one section showing what's going on in the world. And so some of the things to think about as we're thinking about the strategic implications for schools are what are some habits in mind and skills that are needed, will be needed in this. This is happening now in 2015. What are some jobs that will be created, and what are some of the issues? Because clearly as we're looking at that, there are a lot of issues with this. It goes actually to the character issues that we talk about and some of the moral issues that some of these raise. So I just want you to think about that as you're working as a trustee, thinking through what are the strategic implications of where the school is now and where is the school going in the future. One thing to think about is to assess the school using what we would call dashboard indicators. And this is where schools use data to measure trends, to look at the health of the school over time, and what I would call trend analysis. You really want to create a comparison set of organizations. You can do that through the NAIS's DAZZLE, and you can create a comparison organizations, and that's where you're doing a comparative analysis. So we have trend analysis, comparative analysis. And again, the board picture should be on the focus should be on the big picture, looking at both comparative and trend. And it should be used by you as a board to think about the school in this fiduciary manner, this strategic and generative manner. And these dashboards should be regularly reviewed by board committees at regular interviews with regular reports coming to the general board. I'll show you some examples of some financial dashboards. One would be a common one, income and expenses, comparative and trend analysis. Another one would be, might be tuitions and fees, again, comparative and trend. Salary trends are always something that boards look at. Financial assistance trends, comparing and trend. Annual giving trends. Those are often it's a leading indicator of some things. So again, giving trends. So thinking through from your perspective as trustees, what are some of the financial dashboards that are important at your school? There's another group of dashboards that I would call the non-monetary dashboards. One would be student admissions data. It leads to monetary, but this is, I would call it a non-monetary dashboard. Student attrition data. What's going on in student attrition? Staff and faculty attrition. What's happening there? Comparatively and trend analysis. College placement. And for the K-8s, this is a little hard. It's what I would call the K-8 delayed satisfaction syndrome. You don't always have exactly that. You don't have this metric necessarily, although some K-8s actually do track this. So again, as trustees, thinking through what are the non-monetary dashboards that are important to your school. So this is an example of trending over time. This is an attrition analysis that a school that I know of does, and they did this out over a number of years. And so you can see that they are tracking student attrition. So it's from 1 to 21 on the left, and then years going across the bottom. And they actually track their 19-year average. Their average attrition was 10.21 students. But you can see a line between 96 and 97 where there was a major change that took place at the school. And you can see that the trend line actually changed as a result of implementing a major change at the school. At the bottom, you can see then they compared it with NAIS, because NAIS actually had data on this, look at what they classified as low attrition schools, medium, and high. This is just a way to show you that you should be tracking your dashboards over time. And it can be done, just has to be assigned to somebody, and then it should be collected. Very useful data for trustees to look at. With dashboards, remember what I would call the 4 Ds in an R. One is determine the specific financial and non-monetary dashboards that you want to have as a board. That should be a discussion at the board. What should we be tracking? The next one is determine who is actually responsible for collecting and presenting the data. So maybe it's somebody in the business office on the financial side, they collect the data for you. Maybe it's somebody from the admissions office, but who actually is going to do the collection of the data and present it to the appropriate committee? Determine how often and when this information needs to be collected. Is it annually? Is it semi-annually? Is it every other year? How often do you want this information? Which committee of the board is actually going to be responsible for monitoring and analyzing it? Because it's one thing to collect data, but it's a whole other thing to do some analysis of that data. And again, that goes into that generative and strategic thinking on the part of the board. So what does this information mean? What did that trend analysis mean that I was just showing you on attrition? What did that mean?
Valerie, oops, sorry to interrupt. Valerie just asked a question where the data comes from. Where is a good place for people to seek and find this data?
Yeah, so Valerie, it's going to depend on what data you're looking for. So for instance, if you're looking at the student attrition, well, that would come probably right out of your admissions office from your school. And they'd be tracking that. They would have that information for you. If you're going to look at tuition trends at your school, that come out of your business office. If you're looking at comparative tuition trends, that come out of DASL with NAS. So it depends on what it is you want to track. And this really comes down to the values of the board and what's important to you as an organization. And then report from the committee to the entire board. That should happen on a regular basis. Not every meeting, but there should be some time at a meeting that you do updates of what's going on with your dashboards. I'm going to close up with the assessing the board and assessing your school. So this is the piece that I mentioned earlier that I think sometimes boards tend to not do as much as they should. And again, this helps create the healthiness of your board. So we suggest at NYSAIS a Board of Trustees self-evaluation. We can provide you a copy of ours. This is just a sample. I mean, you can do it in a number of ways. It can be we rate schools, the schools rate themselves, boards rate themselves in all the areas. And then they do a 1 to 6 scale and they do a narrative. I personally, I'm always a little cautious about using numerical ratings because they seem so simple. And I prefer the anecdotal I think when people are able to give you anecdotal information about what's going on, it's harder to track over time, but I think it also gives you a sense of the flavor of what's going on with the board. So we would suggest that you do this board self-assessment. You have to do it as part of the NYSAIS accreditation every 5 years. I think it should be going on, ideally it's every year, but practically every other year would be a good practice to really do this and then do something with it. So how do you use self-assessment? Well, one of the things you should do is you should assign a committee to this or a consultant. So some schools hire consultants to do this. That's a little expensive if you're going to do it on an every year basis or every other year, but it could be a committee of the board that's an ad hoc committee that is basically the board self-assessment board committee, and that's their responsibility. You would identify in writing the particular strengths that come out of your board's self-assessment. What is it that you're doing well? You want to keep repeating that and doing that even better. You want to prioritize those strength areas. What do you do best as a board? What should you keep doing? That's setting up your priorities. You want to identify, and I would suggest doing it in writing. If it's important, it should go in writing, your growth areas. What are you not doing well? And I can tell you right now, because we work with dozens and dozens of boards, no board's got it all right. No board. And that means that there are always growth areas for all boards. That's healthy. Identifying them in writing and saying, these are the 2 areas that we want to work on in the board, as a board over the next year, over the next 2 years. You prioritize your growth areas. You're not going to be able to do them all. So again, put them in priority order. Which committees would participate in this? Maybe again, it's a standing committee or ad hoc committee. Maybe a priority might be in the fiduciary side. Well, that might be with your finance committee. You want to develop an implementation timeline for the board as far as using your self-assessment and which areas you've decided to prioritize and then grow from. Who's going to do it? When's it going to be done? And in this area, I would suggest that you use 15 to 20 minutes at every board meeting just to do an update on the board self-assessment. And, 15 minutes is probably plenty of time if you're doing it on a regular basis. So that is the 50-minute overview of being a trustee and thinking in terms of a trustee. So I thought I'd spend the last few minutes, and I will stop sharing my screen actually. And so if we want to, we can just have a conversation about any of the topics we've covered. Questions, answers, thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts about your practices as trustees and what's working well for you. And those of you who are new, what are you finding as a new trustee?
Hi there, this is Andrew Whitaker. Can I just start with a quick question?
Sure, absolutely, Andrew. I
think something that would be really helpful, and this is what we're a small school going through the accreditation process, and it seems like, of course, the responsibility of the board is to drive the accreditation process to make sure that we're doing all the things that we're expected. Know what the steps are, et cetera. Go through it in a very disciplined, rigorous manner, et cetera. And it seems like that's what's going to, over the next couple of years, completely dominate the functions of the board for the most part. I mean, of course, there's a lot of other things around the day-to-day functioning of the school, but a lot of that is going to be to guide the school through the process. And then after that, what'll be interesting is how we transition to, I would consider to be more of a normal operation. And so what I think would be interesting is, from a mindset perspective, of course, you have to be doing all the right things at the right time. Yep. But I think that it seems like for us, it's very, very clear what our priorities are, and that's moving forward with accreditation. And then after that, it's going to be, just making sure that we continue to do all the things that, that we're expected to, that represent best practices. So I think for us, we're almost looking at it as, there's, the next year and a half, 2 years, and then moving on from there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to balance that. Yeah, so
let's just start with the governance side, which is chapter 2 of the accreditation manual. If a board looks at all 19 of those criteria and they're doing all 19 of them well, they're running as an amazing board. And so that really becomes your blueprint for how you should organize yourself as a board, how you should behave as a board, the things you should be doing as a board. As I said, when you did your self-assessment, I would start off with the self-assessment of the board. And where are you now? What are you doing well? And some things you're doing probably great, and other things, they're not as good. What are your priorities? And then go to the section that I was talking about, which is then assigning it to committees and then having committees deal with those 19. On the accreditation through NYSAIS is much larger than just governance. I mean, it really is the look at the school throughout all aspects of the school, right? And the board does not do all those pieces. I mean, they're doing the governance. That is your responsibility, is the governance piece. It's your responsibility to make sure that somebody's doing the finance piece. Now, the finance piece is a joint project between the business office and the board, because that is a joint responsibility of the fiduciary side. So the business office will be doing part of the finance, as well as the board itself or the finance committee. The other areas of the accreditation, whether it's program, which is an important part, the mission, that should be out into different committees. And so that, again, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I know George, when he works with schools through the accreditation process, talks about the different ways that schools can do that. We had a conversation recently about this with a group, and we were talking to them about different ways you can set up the accreditation. It should not all rest on one person. If accreditation is done well, at the end of the day, everybody feels very validated. They feel that they're part of the process, and it really gives them a good roadmap forward. We suggest that the accreditation can lead right into the strategic plan, that they should not be separate things that, the accreditation is really a deep look, a deep dive at your school, an aspirational dive. We look at the balance between aspiration and compliance. So that's what I would suggest to start with, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. That was extremely helpful.
Great. Other thoughts, comments from this group? We have just a couple minutes left in our session.
We were surprised that you recommend so much time on self-assessment at each meeting. We do it in May, and then we set goals based on our self-assessment, and we sort of remind ourselves of those goals at each meeting, but we don't really spend 15 minutes of it on each meeting.
Because I think that it depends. If you're doing it a little bit at a time, it's a little easier to manage, actually, rather than say, okay, we're gonna wait, and then in May we have a big meeting, then we decide what we've done, and then we move forward, and then we don't see it again until May. It's the difference in teaching in a classroom between formative assessment and summative assessment. I think it should be formative assessment that you should be looking at it periodically. So, and maybe it's not 15 minutes. I mean, maybe you only want to dedicate 10 minutes. I don't know. But, and maybe, but the point is to dedicate a portion of each meeting to it. So on everybody's mind, it's not just, okay, we've got to do this now in May. Let's get it done. Let's do our assessment. Where are we going? Because you're always trying to improve. It's sort of like if you're trying to lose weight, you don't want to look at the scale every 6 months. You got to look at it a little more often than that.
Okay, that's a good point.
We have a question in the chat too, Mark. Valerie asks, how many trustees should you have on a board?
That's a great question. I mean, legally, Valerie, the minimum is 5 in the state of New York. I think kind of the sweet spot is someplace between 14 and 20 is a really nice number, someplace in there. If you get too small, there's too much to be done, and you burn out all your trustees. If you're too big, that you have to really you have to plan to work your committees. I think about 16, 17. NYSAIS, I think we have 21 trustees in NYSAIS. That's a really great number. It works really well. It allows us to have committees. It allows us to have functioning committees. So I think it does depend on the school. It's not a very glamorous thing sometimes to be a trustee at an independent school, so it's hard to recruit good trustees. But it is important to have a good number who are very dedicated. Charles, I know that you've been on for 15 years, and I think that is fantastic, and particularly get alum parents. I love having alum parents on boards. I think they make really good trustees.
We have a follow-up to that too, the percentage that should be parents.
That is really a tough question. Some schools, just by their nature, have a lot more parents. It's a little harder with parents because you really do wear 2 hats, and you by nature have a conflict of interest because you have a child at the school. So, but once you understand, then you can get past it. If you can get past it, then current parents make great trustees. Sometimes like a third, and a third is really nice. So we might have a third of current parents, a third of alums, and maybe a third of community. Community is really hard to get though. So, some good balance between current parents who really know what's going on, they have a sense for it, and one parents who have that larger view. But current parents as trustees should also be able to take the larger view.
Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time. I think we could probably keep going for another 30, 40 minutes with a bunch of questions. But I wanted to thank all of you so much for your participation, your active involvement in this discussion, this conversation. And we hope this won't be the last time that you choose to spend some time with us at NYSAIS-Now on topics related to governance and managing schools. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we will make a recording of this session available to all of you. Feel free to share that with other members of your board or other people. And our next session will be coming up on April 13th, which will be led by Mark Brossman, who is a special school finance expert, and he will be talking, school law expert, an attorney who does a lot of practice with schools, and he will be talking on legal issues with Donna Lazarus, another attorney in his office, and they will really do a fabulous session on April 13th. So more information will come to you about that, but please come back again. And thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.